What we realized, I think, in the probably Q3, Q4 of 2023 was that we had a political problem that required a political response.
Mm.
And so what we decided to do was to build the largest political operation any company has ever built, any industry's ever built, to respond to it.
Welcome to Policy Catalyst. I'm Caroline Malcolm, and after my own transition from a long career in the public sector into a fast-growing tech company, I wanted to dig deeper into what it means to be an effective policy practitioner, but outside of government. So in these conversations, we're going to be sitting down with some of industry's foremost leaders on policy to unpack how they think about the function, the unique ways it can support a company's goals, and how they measure success. So now let's dive into today's conversation. Faryar, I'm delighted to welcome you. Thank you for joining us.
Oh, thank you for having me on, Caroline.
Faryar, you're joining us from Washington, D.C., where you lead policy at Coinbase. And I know from my experience with you, this is not your first rodeo when it comes to the world of sort of policy and strategy. So really glad to have you with us to share that experience. Before we dive, though, perhaps into the detail of that, I want you to step back, right back to your very first job. And I'm thinking, when you're still at school or at university, what was the first thing you did to earn money in the world? Did you start a business? Were you entrepreneurial?
I worked in my parents' sandwich shop, actually.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, my parents were, my father was an Iranian diplomat, and we got caught up in the Iranian Revolution. My father was the consul general in New York, so he had quite a prominent position at the time. And then the revolution happened. We were able to stay in the United States. We had to start over. And so we started a delicatessen and food shop in Bethesda, Maryland, which is a suburb of Washington. And every day, 7 days a week, after school, weekends, I would stock shelves, make sandwiches, sell soft drinks, do whatever, clean the place.
That's incredible.
I did that for a number of years.
And what an experience to have gone through too for your family. And I'm sure probably shaped a lot of your outlook. And also it gave you a skill set, which, if things don't work out with policy, you can always go back to the sandwich shop.
I'm very, very good at slicing deli meats. And if you have a preference, thin or thick, I'm very good at that. And so, yeah, no, I'm quite proficient in the sandwich making realm.
All right. We've already learned one thing that we didn't probably expect to know about you, and we'll secret go along. From sandwich shop to chief policy officer, can you take on?
Well, I went to college. My father, because of his diplomatic background, it may have been because of his example that I was always interested in trying to figure out how to be in a world similar to his. So I always thought there was an interesting thing to do that was kind of business related, kind of international, but also public policy, government related. And all of this was kind of irrational because, here we had no money, no connections. We weren't officially refugees, but we were more or less had taken refuge in the United States from, the political upheaval. So the idea that all of those things could come together and I would have a space in there in the middle of that Venn diagram was kind of ludicrous. But I went to grad school and then I decided to go to law school because I thought it was a good, safe way to, have a career that managed downside risk, particularly given financially we were in quite a strained period. And funny enough, I had applied to Harvard Law School and I got a letter from the Kennedy School inviting me to apply for the public policy program there.
Okay.
And I went there kind of on happenstance. I mean, funny enough, I didn't get into the law school, but I did get into the Kennedy School.
Wait, but yeah.
Yeah. And as an immigrant family, if you get a chance to go to, Harvard, you go to Harvard because you have to.
No matter which.
What's that?
No matter which school.
No matter which school, even if it was as a, clerical worker in a basement somewhere, you just go. And the place was transformational for me. It totally opened my eyes to what policy was like. And it also, gave me skills and all those things, but more than anything, it made me realize that notwithstanding the fact that I was kind of a nobody kid from nowhere, there was a path for me. And so that kind of supercharged my ambitions. I became much more confident in terms of what a career could potentially hold. And so eventually I went to law school. I went to law school after that. And then I was a Washington lawyer and I did what a lot of young lawyers do who want to break into the public policy world, which is I volunteered on campaigns and did a variety of different things. And then ultimately my big break came, actually interesting enough, for one of my classmates at the Kennedy School who worked for a senator who had just become the chairman of the U.S. Senate Finance Committee, which is a pretty big committee in Congress. and they were looking for a junior trade counsel, and I was a young trade lawyer. After a year of sort of interviewing and not hearing back, and so eventually I got the job, and it just is, it's been amazing since then. It's just been one lucky break after the other from that moment.
So it's interesting you say that and sort of recognize that aspect, Faryar, because I think often we look back at we look at other people's careers and we're like this was such a natural progression and just kind of clear how they went from one thing to the next. But when you're living it, that's not at all how it seems like. And that combination of sort of being prepared, but then the stars aligning. Yeah, it sounds like it was true when you kind of had that big break as you described it.
Well, yeah, it's so true, because if you look at my career, it actually looks pretty linear. I went to college, got a finance degree, got a public policy degree, got a law degree, worked as a lawyer, primarily doing trade work. I became a trade counsel. Then I ran a part of the Bush trade transition team. I was an assistant secretary running one of the trade bureaus of commerce. And then I transitioned to the White House. And if you sort of look at it, and it looks very, very linear, but I think for particularly young people who may be watching this, there were so many moments where I could have gone left or right or up or down or gone into a different area, and it would all have been good. But it just, these careers, as you said, Caroline, are a product of knowing when a break presents itself, and knowing yourself enough to know where you could provide value, and then just taking enormous kind of career risks, particularly when you're younger and you have kind of financial room, you don't have family obligations and what have you, and you can kind of do crazy things, which I did for a number of times, including coming to crypto, frankly, which I know we'll get to.
Yeah, but maybe though before we get there, so you made it to the White House. What were you doing there, and what took you from there to the next step?
Well, getting to the White House was kind of a funny story, because I when I was a trade counsel, it was during the Bush Gore election. I did no work on the campaign, but a guy who ran the policy function for the Bush campaign called me a couple of times to ask what was happening on legislation, and I answered those questions. You fast forward, a year or two later, the Bush team decides to set up a transition office, and my boss, who was the chairman of the finance committee, had lost his race. So I was at a moment where I was like, I had no job, trying to figure out what to do. So I reached out to him and I said, "Well, can I help?" And I ended up becoming one of the first of two staffers on the Bush transition. Oh. He went on to become the Deputy National Security Advisor for International Economics. And 3 years later, he asked me to leave commerce and come and work for him. So I just want to say that my path to the White House was, was a lot of like happenstance and what have you.
And relationships, it sounds like.
And relationships, yeah, for sure.
But also not necessarily knowing which of those relationships would be the ones that would become important for your career. I mean, it sounds like, you had this interaction, a kind of year or two go past, and then suddenly this person's back in your life and you're like, oh, okay, it's this one which is going to make the difference.
Yeah. And what happens, and this will sound funny, but your friends end up being the large, and your sort of your semi-social or professional social network becomes everything professionally. And I always tell young people, you have to think about how you present yourself to, in all circumstances. So not to be, you need to be yourself, you need to let your hair down, all that kind of thing. But at the same time, there's people that are assessing you all the time, and people may love to be your friend, but may never in a million years recommend you professionally, just because as funny as that may sound. And so, they'll help you in a crisis, but they won't kind of put themselves out there to help you with the job. And so you have to be kind of help them be in a position where they're comfortable to help you. And I think that helped me without realizing it. I think people sort of had a sense of that I was organized enough and kind of, I don't know, responsible enough that if they did recommend me for things, I would make every effort not to screw it up. And so that helped a lot.
Yeah. No, I think that's very true. You never know when you're making the impression that will count.
Yeah, absolutely.
And hopefully if you enjoy what you're doing, that's sort of, that kind of becomes part of the course. But I think sometimes in the day-to-day slog, it can occasionally get lost. Particularly sort of strong discussion around, particular issues, the importance of kind of keeping that sort of very professional aspect.
Absolutely.
Faryar, did you move straight from the White House to the private sector?
I did. So I was the Deputy National Security Advisor for International Economics. And so my job was to be the principal staffer for President Bush on international economic issues, so trade, finance, development, humanitarian assistance, international energy policy, international economic policy. So it was, and then also my job was also to, on behalf of the NEC and the National Economic Council and the National Security Council, coordinate the agencies on the president's international economic agenda. So it was quite a big job. It was an extraordinary job.
Yeah.
But it didn't translate necessarily to a very clear private sector job and that's one of the problems with government jobs, particularly as you get more senior, they become intoxicating because you're making big decisions, you're around important people, but you're also not developing hard skills. You're developing the much more subtle and probably more important skills of judgment, relationships, experience, and so it was a big kind of open question of what I would do when I left government to go in the private sector. And one path would have been to go back to the trade world, where I had pretty good technical skills.
And become, presumably.
And become what?
And become a lawyer again.
Yeah, exactly. And be a trade lawyer. And that's a very normal, in Washington, that's a very well-trodden path where you kind of go back, become a senior lawyer somewhere, and then, advise clients and what have you. But what I ended up doing was that I was approached by Goldman Sachs to come work there. And it was kind of a heady recruiting experience because they were telling me that, I was going to do this and that and the other, but I could tell they really had no idea what they were going to. Yeah. I knew enough to know that they had no idea. And this is before the financial crisis. So Goldman did not have a central global government affairs function. Had a few people in Washington, I think one person or two people in London and one in Tokyo. And that was the entire team. And so I went in and I sort of thought, all right, well, I know enough stuff that I bet I can go there and kind of be valuable. And so the first couple of years of my time at Goldman were largely me advising on political risk issues, particularly on M&A transactions that have maybe had a political or regulatory component to them. I ultimately built kind of a franchise at Goldman where I would work with our M&A teams, working with CEOs and management teams and boards in assessing risk. And it became a very quick way that I became credentialized inside the company as being very commercial and being able to take this kind of government function, which wasn't that important at the time, and turning it into, a very, very commercial thing. And then we got into the financial crisis at late 2008, and then the whole world blew up and the function changed dramatically, which I'm happy to talk about. But the first 2 years were very much me figuring out what would be value added, because Goldman actually does this. I think other companies do. They just sort of hire people they think are interesting. And then if they can figure it out, it's amazing. And if they can't figure it out, then they move on to the next ones.
Yeah, they never probably spell it out quite that clearly. But it's interesting you say in terms of knowing that you had to sort of be able to translate your skills into the commercial world. And that was the sort of ticket to being able to sort of survive and thrive in the private sector. And I think it's something which can be difficult, or maybe often policy people don't think about. They're like, oh, well, I'm just going to do the same sort of thing I was doing in government. But that's not really the job. And I guess suddenly you were in a role at the very heart of the company's sort of fortunes as the financial crisis hit, and everyone, it was all eyes.
Yeah, I mean, it was searing. It was a searing experience. But we went through the financial crisis, and, Congress, the U.S. regulators, but all the global regulators and the global institutions, the Basel Committee, and then a number of institutions that were set up in response to the crisis, the Financial Stability Board and others, and the G20, all decided that the world had to reassess and redesign the regulation of financial services from the ground up. And if you know anything about financial services, it's generally the product of iterative steps dating back 80, 90, 100 years on bank regulations, market regulations. And nobody exactly knew what the full architecture, why the architecture was exactly built the way it was, and how you would undo it and reset it. But I had a lot of experience dealing with global bodies because of my government role, working with the G8 in particular, the IMF, I guess to some extent the BIS, but some of these the World Bank and others. So I became the global head of government affairs, and my job was to kind of figure it out. So we went from, 8 people to I forget how big the team is now. It's probably like 80, 90 people at Goldman. And we had to hire people globally, and we had to figure out not just how you lobby Congress, which, I think people know generally how to do that, but how do you lobby an administration? And this is the Obama administration during a period of enormous political fury at the financial sector. Some of it possibly deserved, some of it I think was probably overdone, but it was sort of it was what it was. But at the same time, you have to figure out how to deal with these institutions that nobody had ever had to deal with before as actively: the Basel Committee, the Committee on Payments and Market Infrastructure, the Financial Stability Board, IOSCO, which is the International Organization of Market Regulators, and that was the that was the mandate, which as a professionally was extraordinary opportunity,
Yes.
but it was a lot of like making it up as we went along, and but it was amazing. It was an amazing experience.
And that, I mean, I do want to dig into with you a bit about like what that team structure looked like. The fact, it was global government affairs, whereas now you're chief policy officer. Like, are those meaningful differences? Are they just customs? But maybe before we do that, we'll finish your path then from this very sort of heady time at Goldman. You hadn't had enough fun there dealing with regulators and really being at sort of the heart of some very like significant political discussions. So you came over to the digital asset world. Was that the trajectory?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I've been at Goldman 15 years, and I've seen sort of gone into the financial crisis and come out on the other end of it. And 10, 11, 12 years on, a lot of the work had sort of been settling in. And then at that moment, I got a call from a headhunter who said that the people at Coinbase wanted to talk to me. And I always say this, even though probably shouldn't admit it. I actually didn't know what Coinbase was.
Well, it was a very different time then. In your defense, right? Not
Yeah.
quite what name it is today.
And so this was maybe a bit more than 4 years ago. And then I talked to initially the COO, the president, and then I talked to the CLO, and then eventually I talked to the CEO. And I was just immediately, I thought, I got to do this. This is very cool because, well, one, I liked the management team. I just thought they were extraordinary. And I never worked for a founder, which people who haven't done that, it's a huge privilege if you get a chance to do that. But it was also a chance to do kind of almost a redo of what I did at Goldman, in the sense that you have a very disruptive technology. It's transformational, but it takes the old paradigms and forces the public and policymakers to confront themselves with that decision of how to change it and under what terms to change it. And so I quickly understood that crypto is transformational, and it requires a strategy to introduce the technology, the policymakers all around the world, to those same institutions that I got to learn, about and kind of build strategies around at Goldman, and do the same thing on crypto. And then when I got to Coinbase, it became kind of a version of what happened at Goldman, which was a year when there was some skepticism and suspicion of crypto, but also a lot of people accepting that there's enormous potential there. And then you had the crash of kind of the market crash in late 22, I guess it was. And then the scandals with FTX and others. And so it was sort of like the same kind of life cycle of Goldman, where nothing could go wrong, everything went wrong, and then you had to kind of rebuild from the ashes. And it's been extraordinary. It's been an extraordinary experience.
That must have felt in many ways incredibly risky. You're at a very established institution, and they come to a company which you don't even know what they are. They're in an industry has certainly had its fair share of criticisms over the years, gone through some enormous highs and incredible lows. I mean, besides the sort of management team, that opportunity to work with the founders, how did you calculate that decision and that risk that the professional risk, you were taking on?
Well, the scope of the mission is what attracted me. And then in particular, when I talked to the CEO, he was Brian Armstrong, who's an extraordinary visionary person, genuinely a visionary. He was clear that, he thinks in a way a little bit differently than most people do, in the sense that he's very clear that the mission of Coinbase is to promote economic freedom
Yeah.
and that the technology is a way to catalyze, and the products that Coinbase builds are ultimately in service of that broader mission of promoting economic freedom. And so I loved the fact that it was an enormous mandate, and he had a very enormous, kind of almost historical kind of perspective on the role of the function and in navigating kind of the challenges that were in front of us and the opportunity. And I talked to him about specific things that I wanted to do, and he was very much kind of like, great, let's do it, including, putting out our own kind of framework of what regulation should look like. And this is 4 years ago, which nobody had really kind of thought through exactly how you would go about doing that. And then I think the part that also attracted me, which took some adjustment from me on my part, was the crypto community is a grassroots organization, or not organization, but community. And so, they're very visible on Twitter or X now. And so it was really interesting to having been in these very buttoned down institutions over the course of my career. I go on a in a company that had just gone public, but is still in many ways a startup led
Yeah.
by a founder with very visionary kind of ambitions, with a huge community, tens and tens of millions of customers around the world. I don't know, 400 million people around the world who've adopted crypto, and many are passionate about it, to put it mildly. And so I was in a much more visible role, actually, in a funny way, and I enjoyed that, actually, kind of learning how to find my voice on X and LinkedIn in a way that spoke to the community in a way that I had an obligation to do, because the work I did was for sure on behalf of Coinbase, but it was on behalf of this broader mission of economic freedom. And the constituency for that most vividly are the, hundreds of millions of people who've adopted crypto and kind of see it as an empowering technology for themselves. So people, I think, notice that my public profile has changed since I moved, but I had an obligation to speak to and develop a dialogue with the millions and millions of people out there who use crypto, who kind of were watching me in this role, and whether I was authentic to their mission and their kind of aspirations for what the potential of this technology was. And that's it was a hard thing to adjust to, but it was also something that, it's an enormous, enormous privilege, and one I've been very happy to take on.
So that's interesting, because normally I think about sort of the distinction between people's personal brand and the sort of company brand. But here you're also talking about a sort of a third element, because Coinbase is such a sort of standard bearer for the space. You also have this sort of community brand, in a sense, like you as the representative of the broad, and it is it can be a very broad church, crypto. You as a representative of that community, as well as the specific interests of Coinbase, and then you as an individual. How do you think about those kind of three different kind of roles that you play? And so when you're coming out, you're speaking publicly on Twitter, on LinkedIn, etc. Yeah, how do those different pieces fit together?
It's a huge sort of ongoing, three-dimensional chess. So, my job is to represent the company in front of policymakers, regulators around the world, and be a bridge for the company to those decision makers. And then it's my job to be credible and a bridge with policymakers back to the crypto world. And because of my relationships and my credibility and my, reputation, I've been able to do that, I think, in a way that, had a bit of a head start just because of the background I brought. And I was pretty well known in the central bank world, finance, ministry world, regulator world. I mean, all those people kind of knew me and were kind of surprised that I made that jump. And so, but it gave me an opening to have a dialogue. But the third constituency is the public. And so the crypto public, and the best way to stay close to them is to keep an eye on X, or formerly Twitter. And so a lot of times when I'm posting in part to, for sure deliver messages out, but it becomes catalytic of getting messages back, from the community. And you have to balance that. And we talk about this all the time inside the company. For sure we're trying to advance the interests of the company. And so normally if you talk to a policy person in any other industry, they have shareholders and they have the board and the management.
Yeah, and that's center, right? Yeah.
Yeah. But, and then you have customers for sure. But you have a community here, like a genuine community. It manifests in a lot of different ways. And you have to become, at minimum, very, very sort of familiar with where people are coming from, what they're worried about, what their ambitions are for the technology. and then kind of navigate that. And, so it requires a lot of work, and it requires a fair amount of time just sort of surveying what people are saying. But it's an investment that you have to make, particularly in a role like mine, which is to more strategically manage the team. And my job is in part to sort of see the guardrails in a way that maybe the team doesn't necessarily have to see as they're executing on, this part of the role or that part of the, that this particular objective. My job is just to make sure that we're sort of staying in the middle of a road where the line markers are almost impossible to see for most people, but my job is to be able to see them and stay in the middle of them.
So you mentioned there your team, and you gave us a little bit of color before on what that looked like at Goldman. Could you tell us a little bit about what that looks like at Coinbase, and also how those two differ and why, where those differences sort of stem from?
Well, I think the difference is we have a lot of running room here because in the sense that the Goldman team was extraordinary, enormously talented people, but the context is different. You have a bank that's been around for 100 and plus years and has a deep kind of regulatory, supervisory oversight of it on the in every market in which it operates. Plus, it just has certain expectations around it just because it is such a well-established institution. At Coinbase, you have much more room to define the road and then figure out how you travel down the road. So when I started, I was the first policy hire. There was a colleague who played a really important role early on, but eventually I had to hire all the people. So I went from a team of just myself, plus this person who I inherited from the legal department to, I think we're probably, if you sort of talk about policy and the related functions that support us, the comms functions and business operations, we probably have about 45 people that do policy work or policy adjacent work. Plus we work very closely with the lawyers and the business people and what have you. In crypto, that number is probably 5x
Right.
a policy team, and that has certain obligations that come with that. But and I'm happy to talk about how we're organized if that's of interest.
No, I think it would be. Because your reach is really global. What does that then, how does that play out? And also some of those regional differences. My own experience, we tended to often use a lot of external consultants also in the US market where that's much more common. It's less the case elsewhere. The goals of the policy function might differ between those different regions. So yeah, a little bit of color. Global spread.
Well, the team is divided into three parts. So there's a U.S. policy team that does all state and federal, international team that covers everything outside the United States, and then what I call the global regulatory policy team, whose job it is to kind of deal with the technicalities of regulation. So it's essentially in support of the U.S. and international teams. And the global policy team does most of the drafting of comment letter responses, consultation responses, the various analytics that we take into regulators to make our arguments about this or that. Each of those is headed by a vice president. So for a team of about 40, 50 people in the company, I'm the C-suite officer as a chief policy officer with 3 vice presidents who run it. So there's a huge investment at Coinbase in the policy function relative to what you see at other companies, but also in the seniority, the fact that we have that level of seniority. And what I've ended up being lucky is I've hired, I think, literally the best policy team in any industry anywhere in the world without any question. So our U.S. policy lead is a woman named Kara Calvert, who is an extraordinary talent, enormously proficient technically, but also proficient politically, knows everybody in Washington, a very dynamic, kind of forward-leaning, kind of proactive leader. Our international team, and she worked for Coinbase for 4 or 5 years, and she was one of the leading tech lobbyists in town. And so she knows the space and worked for any number of fintech companies. And so she has just sort of knows where all the bodies are buried on kind of the world of fintech and tech, and had been with the company as an external consultant before I brought her in, so she knew the company. The international team is run by a guy named Tom Duff Gordon, who I think is, without question, the best international policy guy on the planet. Ran Credit Suisse's EMEA policy function for a number of years. Had been there 50, so he had a similar background to mine, and he's made a similar transition to mine, going from a much more kind of established, storied bank institution to a founder-led crypto tech startup. And he's been enormous, hugely creative in terms of, and willing to get on a plane at any moment, and has developed relationships from Hong Kong to Singapore to to Canberra to Delhi and Mumbai and Bangalore and Brasilia and anywhere in between. And then the third vice president is a guy named Scott Boggess, who is the former acting chief economist at the SEC and has spent 15 years at the SEC. And he started working with us as a consultant. He was a professor at the University of Texas and actually was quite a senior member of the faculty there. And I was able to persuade him to come leave his faculty position and come work. And he is, a PhD economist, extraordinarily well-known, experienced in the regulatory space. And we produce some of the most impressive content in response to consultations. And he's supported by a team of expert technicians, including some consultants and others who are professors and PhDs. And so we operate at the highest end of policy, which is sort of the hard analytical, sort of theoretical end, all the way to the raw politics, which have gotten a lot of attention in the United States. And we do all of that all under one roof, which has been enormously fun. It's been unique. And that's the reason why I don't think there's any question we're the best policy function in any industry anywhere, even if I do say so myself.
I think one of the, I guess, two things I want to double click on. One is the regulatory policy team. So just to be clear, they focus more on the licensing process, or is that a different team? How do you think a bit about what they do as opposed to the sort of the other two policy teams?
Yeah, so our lawyers do most of the licensing and registrations. We support them, but they're the lead on that. But every jurisdiction in the world, as they're trying to figure out how to regulate crypto, and how to develop a regulatory framework or a legislative framework around crypto, we'll put a consultation out or a notice of rulemaking or something like that. So the global policy team's job is to answer, essentially write comment letters in response to the questions being asked by the Australian government or the Hong Kong financial regulator or the IMF or the Basel Committee or the CPMI or the BIS or any number of these institutions. And those answers often involve very technical answers, regarding how we manage risk, liquidity, various number. And then sometimes they involve analytics. There's a lot of kind of assumptions that regulators make regarding the volatility of crypto, whether it's the risk associated with crypto, holding crypto assets is manageable. And a lot of that responding to that involves doing analytics regarding what is the actual volatility characteristics of crypto. Can you risk manage against them? How do you do hedges in the crypto space? These are all kind of technical things. And our team is very well equipped to work with our business and our risk teams to, develop very, very compelling responses to all of those.
That's helpful. The other thing I want to double click on was you sort of mentioned you're at the sort of the raw edge of sort of the political aspects of policy roles. And I guess one of the things I think your team and you as being most famous for is the sort of Stand with Crypto campaign, because I think it really, in a way that perhaps not many others, either in the space or generally in policy roles, did really go out on a limb on the political front. And that was clearly a sort of a very conscious decision. But how do you think about the Stand with Crypto effort?
Well, in a way, it was something that Brian talked to me about, Brian Armstrong, from the first conversation I had with him. He said, we have, I forget the number, 40, 50 million customers around the world. Can't we harness them and get them activated? And I think, to his credit, he saw that in a way that I didn't fully have my arms around until a bit later. And then we eventually organized the group. But to give you a sense of context, what happened is the Biden administration, for reasons that were largely incoherent, decided that they wanted to destroy the industry and drive it offshore. And so there was this concerted, and I think in many instances, unlawful and improper use of power, government power, to try to drive the crypto industry outside the United States, which was insane, at a moment where China's investing heavily, every other financial center is investing, to have the U.S. government regulators on a campaign not sanctioned by Congress to try to destroy an industry. And so what we realized, I think in the probably Q3, Q4 of 2023, was that we had a political problem that required a political response. And so what we decided to do was to build the largest political operation any company has ever built, any industry's ever built, to respond to it. And it had two parts to it. One was Stand with Crypto, which was a grassroots organization that we initially housed inside of Coinbase, but eventually we spun it out. It's what's known as a C4 organization. So it's an independent organization. We're the primary funder of it. We're a vendor to it. So we do all the tech work. They have a pretty compelling website that we're the tech vendor for. But at this point, and this is hard to believe for some people, We have 2.1 million people, Americans, who've signed up as crypto advocates on the Stanford Crypto platform. And so the team at Stanford Crypto had this dialogue with 2.1 million people who had raised their hand and said they wanted to get active. And so they did very traditional get out the vote operations, made sure all these people would who hadn't registered to vote, register. They knew where their voting area was. And then they developed a very tough scorecard that scored each candidate on their crypto record, and then through text interfaces and through the website and through other means spoke to that community and kind of made sure they were informed on what's at stake. They knew when the primaries were, where the voting precinct was, that kind of thing. And in particular, they did it in the U.S. in the 7 swing states that were most important in the presidential race, plus Ohio, and it's hard to do the actual analytics, but we ran a lot of data and analysis on the crypto vote, on the crypto community, and we found it was a broad cross section of the population, but the position of candidates on crypto was actually something that was a consideration and was influential in the voting decision of a significant percentage of these people. And so we presented that to both the Biden and the Trump teams just to say, listen, you may not know this, but there's a constituency there. And the Trump people ran with it. I think it fit into their broader strategy of speaking to low propensity voters. There is a cohort of crypto voters who are kind of younger, more male, lower propensity voters, and the Trump people were trying to reach them, and crypto became a way to reach them. And I think that proved to be an extraordinarily smart strategy on their part. That was available to the Biden and eventually Harris people as well, but they just didn't see it the same way.
That makes sense. You mentioned there was a second leg too.
Yeah. So the second leg was a super PAC, which in the U.S., as you know, you can have an independent entity organized, and you can contribute to it. So we contributed $50 million, which is American politics is an extraordinary sort of mind bender in terms of how much money is involved. But ultimately, the organization raised, I think, $175 million and deployed about $120 million of it in supporting pro-crypto candidates and in opposing anti-crypto candidates. And they did this in a lot of races around the country. And as a result of their work, that we have by far the most pro-crypto Congress, ever. And we have, we've become a political force, and we've doubled down on this for the next cycle. And so the plan that we have with these organizations is to have them play a similar role, the Super PAC to play a similar role in the next cycle, and then the grassroots organization, which is at 2.1 million right now, to try to help them ramp up to hit 4 million advocates in the United States. We are interestingly, Caroline, launching Stanford Crypto now. It's run through a different entity, but it's actually run out of Coinbase directly outside the U.S. So we have Stanford Crypto now.
And beyond the UK, are we going to see Stanford Crypto in other parts of the world?
Yeah. So we're live in Canada and in Australia, and then there are a few other markets that we're looking at, which watch this space.
Faryar, I know we're close on time. There's so much I want to talk to you about, which I'm not going to get to today. Let me just turn in our final minutes. I want to talk a little bit about when you're hiring, what you're looking for. What are the things that you feel you can teach people? What are the things you think they have to come to the table with? I'm thinking about one of the big ones. You had a really deep government background yourself. To be good at policy and these sorts of roles, do you think that's necessary?
To have a government background?
Experience, that sort of internal to government?
I think it helps a lot. You can get away without having it, but it helps just a lot, because there's just there's something about having been on the other side of the curtain and you just understand how policymakers work. That's enormously important. But I think for my team, there's a second dimension to it, which is being proficient with the community. So there are a number of folks on my team who are very crypto native, but who never have had government experience, actually don't know the government that well, but they do the community engagement side of it. And they're extremely proficient at talking to the community. They understand in a way that's better, better than I do myself. And so, those skills matter. But I think in terms of hiring people, I think you just want to find dynamism and energy and a sense of proactivity. I find people who are hungry, lean in. And then for more senior hire, it's a bit easier. I sort of generally let them talk, and then I get a sense of whether they're action oriented. Coinbase is is a really amazing place to work. But it can be hard if you're not a person that takes the initiative and wants to get stuff done and is willing to take risks and doesn't mind, jumping on a plane and going here and there and everywhere. And so looking for people that have that kind of dynamism. And we initially started hiring only more senior people, more experienced people. But we've brought in more and more junior people, and they've been amazing, which has been super fun for me to see people who kind of come out of university or what have you and are just killing it for us and growing while they're on the team, and that's been really really special.
Final question, Faryar. How do you think, although I could go on really, success, it's notoriously difficult, or at least that's what people say, to measure whether you have been successful. So that's whether you yourself or your team members that you're looking at. So you get to the end of that year, you're doing that assessment. What does success look like and how do you measure? Is it number of consultation papers there, or you have a more refined way at looking at, say, impact rather?
Yeah, it's a struggle within policy work because you can easily mistake action for outcomes, because you can go to a million meetings, you can get to know a million policymakers, and in the end of the day, if the outcome doesn't change, then you haven't done anything. And so we have two primary metrics, the most important of which is product unlocks. Can we start now offering staking in the UK or can we not? And
Right.
anything, 50 good positive meetings are fine, but if you haven't unlocked staking, then you haven't succeeded yet. And so we try to be really, really tough and very much focused on product unlocks. And then related to that, obviously we have to get policy right, but the policy so quickly translates into so many different parts of what we do at Coinbase: the custodial function, the exchange, the decentralized Web3 world, payments. And so it's pretty easy to sort of tie the policy work to product and business outcomes, all in the service of the mission of economic freedom. And interestingly, Brian Armstrong has been very vocal recently in saying, the goal of economic freedom can be advanced with the products that we produce, but it can be advanced with the policy work directly. And so that's a new dimension that you'll see more of from us 2025. That's exciting, but it's still taking shape, and I'm looking forward to it.
Well, Faryar, I am very excited to see it too, because you really do, I think, bring this interesting combination of both like a significant amount of structure and experience to your thinking about the function, but also, a lot of innovation, to, what would otherwise be relatively staid given backgrounds in sort of banking and finance and things. So I always learn a lot from you when we talk, and thank you very much for joining us, Faryar.
Oh, thank you, Caroline. I appreciate it. It was really good to talk to you.